With all this talk of how badly Fox had botched the X-Men franchise, you'd think they took a hacksaw to the head and left the bloody corpse on the side of the road. No! There was a lot of different opinions of where the franchise went off the rails. There wasn't a lot of common ground because some thought everything up to Apocalypse was great, others thought Days of Future Past was the last great team movie, and others even said First Class was the only one worth watching. Well, I'm here to tell you that you're all wrong. Okay, that was a bit of a joke. That was just in jest, because everyone has their different opinions on this and yours is just as valid as mine. But in this video, I will be putting myself to the task of how I believe the studio ended up where they did. And to do that, we have to start at the revitalization of the franchise with First Class. Even though most tend to agree that Days of Future Past was a good X-Men movie and Apocalypse was the one that set the franchise off the rails, I would even say that the seed of the problem started all the way back in First Class. Oh, we're definitely spilling the X-Men tea.
Wait, is that you?
Oh, 2009. What a wonderful year it was. After The Last Stand and Wolverine Origins, it was pretty clear that Fox could not afford to churn out another bad X-Men movie.
Fox very much was going into First Class as a franchise rebuilding year.
Yes.
It was, they recognized that even though those last two movies had made a lot of money, that they maybe hadn't been beloved.
Gosh.
And it was, okay, we've got a new cast, we're going back to the origins in the 1960s. And this is a chance to start fresh again.
Despite the good returns in the box office, it was pretty clear that the response from the last two X-Men movies were overwhelmingly negative. And that was the last of the goodwill that they had built up from X-Men 1 and 2. No one was really interested in seeing another X-Men movie, and they didn't have a fallback franchise in Fantastic Four, since the first two Fantastic Four movies were not so great either.
Oh my God! Come on!
With Iron Man and The Dark Knight exploding onto the scene in 2008, audiences now had their pick of superhero movies to spend their money on. Competition with Warner Brothers and Marvel was ramping up, and if Fox didn't do something to revitalize their properties soon, they would be certain to be left by the wayside. Enter Matthew Vaughn, some people's lord and savior for the X-Men franchise. Matthew Vaughn was brought in to breathe a new life into the X-Men franchise, coming hot off the tails of Kick-Ass, which, fun side note, had the tale of two Quicksilvers in it.
I met with Emma Watts at Fox, and she said that we're serious. We saw Kick-Ass and was blown away by it, and we feel X-Men needs to be reinvented.
Matthew Vaughn made it very clear that while he was keenly aware of the existence of the original trilogy, he did not want to be shackled by it. This gave him more creative liberties with the characters, the plot lines, and the casting calls he made because of it.
And there was that point in time where I thought I was going to sort of, study Ian McKellen and sort of try and get any old films with him as a young man and try and sort of get his voice down, his physicality. And then I spoke to Matthew, and I think our first meeting or second meeting, and he wasn't so keen. He was more interested in me sort of bringing my own voice and my own physicality. So we scrapped that idea, and then I just sort of really just dived into the comic book material and gathered all the information from that.
Matthew Vaughn is a director that believes casting is 90% of the acting, and he made some stellar choices with First Class. James McAvoy as Professor Xavier and Michael Fassbender as Magneto were the best of the best.
You know, I tested them together, and it took me 3 seconds. As soon as they did the first scene, I knew I'd found my Magneto and X.
While there weren't any on-screen tests of the two that I could find, there were countless fan arts that I'm sure painted an accurate picture of what the studio saw.
This is nice.
Was that what you were reading?
This is how. Look at them.
That's terrible.
They are such good pals. Look at you, Michael.
I know.
If we rewind the clock, you'd actually see a lot of skeptics back in 2010, 2011. But James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender have definitely proven that they are the perfect casting choices as their respective characters, and made me toss all my cynicism down the toilet. And just to add, that's a nearly impossible accomplishment considering how beaten down I felt after Wolverine Origins. So, to my future husbands 1 and 2, you should be definitely proud of that. But even though the director got Charles and Erik completely right, there were some characters that he didn't. At this point, Fox didn't know that they had a soon-to-be A-list actress capable of carrying a billion-dollar franchise in their ranks.
Hunger Games!
But I still question the casting choice even from the beginning. According to the director, Jennifer Lawrence was supposedly cast due to her ability to pull off the challenging dichotomy that Raven faces as she transforms into Mystique. That vulnerability that shields a powerful inner strength.
What?
To me, there is a misunderstanding of Mystique's characters even from that. Every iteration that I've read or watched of Mystique has never painted her to be that vulnerable character from the very beginning. Of course, she does have those moments, especially when Nightcrawler and Rogue are involved, but they are few and far between, which makes any moment she is vulnerable in a powerful one.
Sad? You want to talk about sad? I am a shapeshifter, an outcast, even among mutants trusted by no one. I don't have a life of my own. I just steal little bits from other people's lives. But that's how I survive.
But to write Mystique as Xavier's adopted sister, it takes away the difficult childhood that would have hardened her and turned her into the character that she was always supposed to be. Then we have Jennifer Lawrence openly crying and freaking out about the attack on the CIA, which proves that she doesn't have that quiet, inner strength assassin hiding inside her. I would even believe this guy to have more of Mystique's true character than Jennifer Lawrence ever did.
Stay here, my ass! Let's go!
Like, I'm sorry people you don't really know are being killed left and right, but do you really expect this to turn into this?
But I'd rather a bunch of guys stare at me with my clothes off than the way these ones stare at me.
Even Angel here has more of a likelihood in making that transformation than whatever this is. And for Mystique, it's even in her name. Fascinating aura of mystery, awe, and power surrounding someone or something. By writing an entire story from childhood into adulthood, we lose a lot of what makes a character like hers interesting. I'm not saying we can't explore some backstory, but the reason why she was so captivating in the original trilogy was because you didn't know what exactly led her to become that ruthless manipulator that she is. Was it because she was shunned by everyone around her? Was it because she was chased by a mob and lost her son because of it? We don't know, and we may never know, but that's part of the intrigue that she had. Unfortunately, with First Class, they have left no stone unturned, and no mystery not solved, and knowing that Charles was always there for her takes away the pain that she would have otherwise undergone to become the version of Mystique we see in the original trilogy.
Raven Darkholm, that's your real name, isn't it? Or has he convinced you you don't have a family anymore?
My family tried to kill me, you pathetic meat sack.
So while the fresh take with Charles and Erik worked, I'm inclined to say that Mystique's did not. Because even though McAvoy and Fassbender were only asked to use Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen's performances as inspiration, it was not outside the realm of possibility that this Charles Xavier would eventually become this Professor X, and this Erik Lehnsherr would become this version of Magneto. Mystique, however, does not make that connection with Rebecca Romijn's interpretation, especially as the movies go on.
Then why not stay in disguise all the time? You know? Look like everyone else.
Because we shouldn't have to.
Perfection.
I got sick of living that lie.
And that's why you're not in your natural blue form.
I'm gonna be the face of a world that doesn't exist.
Perhaps the argument can be made that it's on future movies to develop that complete transformation of Jennifer Lawrence's Mystique, and that First Class is fine as a standalone. But I would argue that this is the movie that lays the groundwork. If her character was written as a whimpering, scared little girl who was sheltered by Charles for most of her life, it doesn't give you a compelling start for her to become that manipulative shapeshifter assassin that she's supposed to be. That means the whole next movie will need to focus largely on that, or that most of her transformation into the ruthless killer will have to take place off-screen. To me, what happened with First Class seems very much in line with what Matthew Vaughn tries to do. He tries to make the best singular movie he can. And this is not a bad thing. It's actually preferable to make your first movie hit it out of the park, rather than have a person or studio try to build an empire without any proof that your audience will be there for it. Oh, excuse me, there was a dark universe in my throat. But the problem with a singular vision means that there might not be enough wiggle room for the next installment. Matthew Vaughn encountered the same problem in his Kingsman movies. The first one was absolutely bonkers and amazing for all the risks that they took. But he made the active decision to kill off certain characters and do things with the storyline that doesn't prime the audience for a great sequel. Of course, you can force it to work, and it still gives off some frolicking good moments, but some things will just not feel natural, or it might even take away from some of the character moments in the first movie. You deserve so much better, Roxy. I'm not even joking. This is an area I think Marvel gets it right. Stylistically, I wish Marvel would give them a little bit more license to go crazy, but story-wise they have to keep some things in line because that one movie is part of a bigger plan. And depending on how well it is received, it will open gates to future projects either in that trilogy or in a team-up movie. That vision of a greater plan, but still focusing on what makes a good standalone movie, is what makes the MCU a force to be reckoned with. Not many studios or executives are able to thread that balance, and Fox is no exception. The secondary team of characters Matthew Vaughn chose are also proof that his vision was of a singular one. Most of the X-Team mutants have very little star power from the comics and weren't really expected to carry out in the later movies. Apart from Beast, the only real one of name recognition would have been Havoc because he is the younger brother of the X-Men team leader Scott Summers. But that was even a strange choice in itself because he is the younger brother of Cyclops. And Cyclops is a definitively older brother type character.
What? My little brother, he's...
Alive, Scott. Alex is alive.
Oh, man. I thought he was gone, or I would have been out looking for him. I should have been looking for him. I mean, I just accepted it. Why didn't I...
Easy, Scott. Take a breath. Don't blame yourself.
Perfection.
By introducing his younger brother Alex into First Class, they've effectively switched their character roles, and while it could still work for the movie universe, it shows the misunderstanding of the core characters from the very beginning.
You're serious?
I'm very serious. I have complete and utter faith in you.
If this was a standalone movie. Beast's character was not nearly as much of a travesty as Mystique's was, but I think it's important to realize how influential the 90s animated cartoon and the dichotomy of the big ferocious beast quoting Shakespeare and having such a soft tone in his voice and personality versus the version we have on screen.
With faint heart, averted feet, and many a tear, in our opposed path to persevere. They must see that we are not a threat to mankind, but are a part of it.
Overall, Matthew Vaughn's direction to veer away from the original was a net positive. This allowed them room to play as actors and storytellers, but in the grand scheme of things, it showed the first cracks of the foundation that the X-Empire will be built upon. With Marvel definitely upping their game, having released Avengers in 2012 and set to release Age of Ultron in 2015, Fox definitely needed to prove that First Class was not just a lucky break. Enter Days of Future Past, a comic and storyline so iconic to the X-Men universe that its name was enough to send fans into a frenzy. For the uninitiated, though that's probably none of you, Days of Future Past comic was an apocalyptic future where Professor X's worst nightmares come to life. Human and mutants are unable to reconcile their differences, and the machines win. Mutants are killed left and right, and others are put into prisons. Even humans without powers are targeted because they have the capability of producing mutant offspring. So what's wrong with Days of Future Past, you ask? People generally liked it, didn't they? Yes, but that doesn't mean it didn't continue propagating the cracks that started with First Class. Here we get into Fox's greatest hamartia.
Hamartia?
It's a fatal flaw.
Fox's fatal flaw is letting their actors overtake their characters. In solo movies like Logan and Deadpool, focusing solely on these characters works incredibly well. But in big ensemble movies, it often becomes uneven, with the camera favoring some characters over others. In my opinion, Days of Future Past was fairly balanced, with Wolverine taking a backseat in places he had to and keeping the conflict around Charles, Erik, and Mystique. There was nothing on paper about this movie that I didn't like. The characters had proper motivations, the stakes were real, the storyline was tight, and the blend of the old and new cast hit that perfect sweet spot of not too much and not too little. Cinematography and efforts were top-notch, but something still bothered me. It wasn't until a few days after the movie that I realized exactly what it was. Mystique. Big surprise there. By the time Days of Future Past was written in the script stages, Jennifer Lawrence had become a huge star with the Hunger Games franchise and won an Oscar for Silver Linings Playbook. She was everyone's favorite actress at the time, and it was naive to think that Fox wouldn't want to capitalize on that momentum train, especially since they had locked her into a contract prior to that. With the Hunger Games fans and the artsy-fartsy Oscar people at their fingertips, all they needed to do was write and film a script that would give Jennifer Lawrence the limelight and draw those crowds in like moths to a flame. But they couldn't make her into a villain, could they? At the time, she was the face of the new It Girl, and everyone thought she was so relatable and down to earth.
Starring a totally average, down-to-earth girl, just like you.
You are probably one of the most down-to-earth celebrities.
I'm not, I'm just dumb.
And today I'm going to be doing a charisma breakdown of Jennifer Lawrence, and I'm going to be focusing on two things that she is amazing at, which is being more relatable and more likable.
How could they make someone like that into the ruthless villain that Mystique is? Maybe you think I have it out for Jennifer Lawrence, and yeah, I kinda do. But there's something else to consider. You see, there was some controversy over the other characters of Days of Future Past too. Like, why was Wolverine the linchpin between timelines? Most fans echoed this sentiment, like, really? We love Wolverine, we love him to death, but why is he the one to time travel? Why is it not Shadowcat or Bishop like in the comics or animated series? And Shadowcat, Kitty Pryde, her powers are to phase through solid objects. How does that translate to time travel? But why was I okay with these changes and not okay with Mystique? One, I wasn't super thrilled about the changes, but they didn't detract the storyline for me. And simply put, neither one of these changes resulted in a betrayal of the core character. Wolverine is still the rough around the edges good guy that he is, and Shadowcat is still the sweet, team-centered girl that she is. But Mystique, that was supposed to be her ultimate turn into the character from naive into hardened killer. Instead, she became the hero of the movie, preventing Magneto from killing Trask and stopping herself from going down that path too.
I've been trying to control you ever since the day we met. And look where that's got us. Everything that happens now is in your hands.
Don't get me wrong. This moment and everything around it was exceptionally well done. The character beats that Charles went through to talk her down from that ledge was masterfully done and believable by all accounts. It was a good end to her arc and technically a good way to turn her character. That's why the sour taste was just a sour taste. It didn't ruin the movie. In fact, I enjoyed myself a lot. It was just the bitterness in knowing that they had forever changed Mystique's character into a heroic one when I knew she was supposed to be a villainous one.
You happy with that? Because that seemed weird.
But if Fox had been able to take a step back from the Jennifer Lawrence bandwagon and understood that the characters of the X-Men universe are greater than the actors that portray them, and shot this movie differently in a way that was way truer to the spirit of the characters, which would have been a long-term play rather than a short-term one. They could have leaned in hard with Mystique as a villain, unable to be talked or reasoned with. They could have been less camera-focused on her and more focused on Professor, Wolverine, Beast, and whoever they can round up for the ragtag X-Team to stop her by any means necessary. They can struggle with what they have had to come to terms with, but as it was in the comics, the X-Men team need to be put in the forefront to stop the threat. Before watching the movie, I actually had pictured Mystique leaving Days of Future Past similar to how Psylocke left in Apocalypse. She's still clearly set in her ways, but knowing she can't win against the people in front of her, concedes this fight, hopefully to win the next one. Of course, that would take some heavy rewrites and to make sure everything flows well and the ending was just as satisfying, but by changing Mystique's character into a heroic one with this movie caused a huge rift in how the next installment in Apocalypse would be received. If we want to look at how each decision affected the end result, this would be a big one. So even though I rank Days of Future Past highly among the X-Men films, I can't help but notice this movie had a big part to play in the slope downward. Despite having many things going for it, X-Men Apocalypse appeared to be the movie that seemed to have split the fan base. Many think it was brought down by the weakly motivated villain, while others think that it's the most X-Men that's ever been X-Men before, and the action in this movie was definitely unseen in any other installment that came before it. As was the issue in Days of Future Past, Fox's big problem is letting the actors overtake the characters of the story. The problem becomes exponentially more noticeable in Apocalypse with 3 major moments. 1. Charles and Erik. As much as I love seeing Fantasy Husband 1 and 2, their dynamic in Apocalypse did not add any new layer of friendship that we haven't already seen. Fans have responded overwhelmingly positive to the relationship between Charles and Erik from both First Class and Days of Future Past. In both iterations, they had worked together and opposed each other. But in Apocalypse, the problem is that their relationship followed the same exact blueprint. This doesn't add any nuance to their friendship and even puts large focus on Magneto when he loses his new chance at life with his wife and daughter.
Is this what you want from me? Is this what I am?
While really heartbreaking, it didn't quite fit in with the other pieces of the movie, and it would have been far more effective if this scene was part of a Magneto-centered standalone film. Instead, this movie forces that gut-wrenching moment into a runtime that needs to account for Apocalypse, Xavier, and the up-and-coming X-Team. Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique. Was Mystique being on this list really a surprise? By Apocalypse, Jennifer Lawrence had made her distaste for makeup very clear, and she had enough star power to make her character appearance go in any direction that she wanted.
Are you kind of relieved to not be in the blue tights anymore?
Oh my god, yeah. I mean, I'm still on a red carpet, which is the same thing. I'm like, am I sucking in? Ah!
You're not blue in it. Did you finally put your foot down and say...
I am blue in it a little bit, but I put my foot down as much as I could. They were very, very nice to me.
You're happy you're not going to be blue anymore?
I'll never be blue. I don't even think I'll do like aging makeup ever. Just nothing. Stop painting my face.
Simon told me he had to cut a deal with you, that you would only be blue for like 2.6 seconds.
If you watch the series of the movies, you see they're like writing around my blue. Like the first movie, I ended like being like mutant and proud, and then the movie after that, I was like, I changed my mind. Like I didn't. It's tough.
Even if we are going by the movie rules and that Mystique is now fully a protagonist character, the retreat into hiding undermines her entire character development from First Class and paints her as a mutant that is ashamed of the way she looks. The last of which is a clear departure from Mystique as a character, even if she were a hero. And considering that most fans were not completely accepting of her being a hero in the first place, it adds another layer of distaste into her role in the movie. And let's be real, Jennifer Lawrence's aversion to the makeup prevented Mystique from using her powers in any meaningful way. The ending where she posed as Psylocke is arguable, but nothing really happened. The only thing that really happened was her getting choked out and becoming the face of New Women's abuse movement. Do you remember that? That was kind of a silly thing that happened. But hey, that stupid controversy might have at least sparked some buzz for the movie, I would think. In the original trilogy, Mystique had used her shapeshifting abilities to kidnap the Senator, pose as the Senator after he died to prevent a bill from being passed, posed as Wolverine to effectively sneak into Stryker's base, and then posed as Stryker himself to change the course of Cerebro to target humans. All these things caused the plot to drastically change, but when you have Mystique confined to looking like Jennifer Lawrence, what is even the point of being a shapeshifter?
We don't know!
We don't know, bro!
Number 3. Wolverine cameo. And with this movie, it didn't seem like Fox was even sure Apocalypse would do well without him. If you look at the script itself, the whole side quest to Stryker's base was completely out of left field. Stryker and the military's involvement with Apocalypse could be lifted out super easily, and the movie could still play out the same way, which means it wasn't integral into the overarching story. It made for a cool cameo with Wolverine in the Weapon X headgear, but doesn't really contribute in any meaningful way. If you contrast that with X-Men 2, you'll see that everything in that movie is tightly scripted. Nothing is wasted. Visiting Magneto's prison, the attack on the mansion, finding Nightcrawler to find Stryker's base, everything is connected. With Apocalypse, it's connected, but very only loosely. If Stryker taking the X-Men didn't happen, Apocalypse still would have coerced Xavier into giving that message to the world, and Jean still would have heard the hidden message that they're in Cairo. And who knows, if they were at home, maybe they could have salvaged some cool X-Men uniforms for the final boss fight instead of these generic black suits that seem to be perfectly molded to their varying shapes, but I digress. If these 3 requirements were absolutely necessary for Fox to greenlight the movie, I think Apocalypse is actually the best possible outcome of that. The movie was still coherent and had a lot of great moments sprinkled throughout. But if those were not 3 requirements that had to be met, there would have been a lot more room for the younger generation to shine. By introducing major players like Cyclops, Jean, Nightcrawler, Storm, it's almost a disservice to leave them by the wayside. And because I like to brainstorm some possibilities, here are some quickie musings that I had. You know, just floating about, as they do. First things first, Mystique should be cut out of this movie entirely. Or the most is that she becomes a zombified follower of Apocalypse like she was in X-Men Evolution, and they have difficulty fighting her in the final battle. The Professor needs to be the center of it all. Jean and Scott need to be built around him. Maybe he takes them out to their first mission to rescue Nightcrawler, and we start seeing the sparks that are supposed to be there between them. Maybe we see Scott and his insecurities of being a leader, but the Professor's constant support gives him the father figure that he so desperately needs. Maybe we see Jean's hesitancy to use her powers because she has so little control over them. And side note, this doesn't have to be Phoenix related. This could be her accidentally dropping Scott when she's not looking, just for some humor here and there.
Which one of you guys has been putting on weight?
I can hardly hold you.
It's Nightcrawler. Burgers 7 days a week will do that to a fella.
Without Mystique taking up the screen time in Nightcrawler's rescue, we could develop Charles as an actual mentor, Scott as a budding leader, and Jean as an eventual force to be reckoned with. 3 birds, 1 stone. But no, we get the sex appeal Jennifer Lawrence speaking the German.
Magst darfst du Schlappen fahren? Hausen?
I would not drink with you. I'd pour this into my testicles. I would not drink.
But what about Magneto? Magneto in Apocalypse would have been a question mark. He could have been left out of this movie entirely, but I can also see the argument that it was him and Charles who kicked off this original trilogy, so they should be the 2 to bookend it. And no, I'm not saying that just because they're fantasy husband 1 and 2. If we're looking for places of inspiration, I do like the way they had them team up in X-Men Evolution to take down Apocalypse. Especially being on opposite sides in the previous movies, it would be a refreshing direction to take the characters, having them team up in this movie. Many times in the comics or animated shows, Charles and Erik had to reconcile their differences when there was a threat that called upon them to put their differences aside. Even in X2, Magneto had to team up with the X-Team to make sure Stryker didn't succeed in killing all of mutant kind. So teaming up in Apocalypse wouldn't have been completely out of the realm of possibility. And hey, if they were open to making a zombified controlled Magneto, that would have made for a great dynamic between him and Quicksilver, just as it did between him and his daughter Scarlet Witch in X-Men Evolution. Maybe in this rewrite, Magneto creates his own team, priding the way of recruitment being better than Xavier's with his roster of powerful mutants outmatching kids like Cyclops, Jean, and Nightcrawler. This would have provided a different layer to their differing views without putting them in direct opposition with each other. In First Class, they dealt with whether humans or mutants could live peacefully or not. In Days of Future Past, they fought over killing or saving Mystique for the betterment of mankind. And in Apocalypse, they could have explored different approaches they would have in leading the next generation of mutants to come. Contrary to what this sounds like, I'm not here to rewrite Apocalypse from the ground up. I'm only exploring some possibilities if the studio or the creatives behind the movie weren't so set on the on-again, off-again Fassavoy and Jennifer Lawrence show. If they had more confidence in the new characters and their franchise, a lot of creators that fans were looking forward to see would actually be given room to breathe. And I feel the box office would have reflected that. As much as audiences say they want more, they don't want something they've seen 100 times before. And that seems to really be the main nail in the coffin for the 3rd installment of the prequel series. Even though Apocalypse was a bit of a question mark, I don't think it takes any convincing to believe that Dark Phoenix had its problems from start to finish. Again, the main problems persist: the prioritization of actors over characters. And to add another layer to that, the studio was not listening to criticism. By this time, the studio and creatives still haven't responded to the criticism of Mystique's character, and even doubled down on her hero's arc, even though it had a loud protest from the fandom for quite a long time now. And once it was announced that Magneto would be returning, it was also met with a loud protest from fans as well. While people responded positively to Michael Fassbender, people knew that he had no part in the Phoenix Saga, so why include him? These protests were made vehemently clear early on in the development process because the actors had to renew their contracts for this to work. Fox could have taken these protests into consideration, but they seemed so sure that the mass majority of audiences would be ecstatic to see these three again that they seemed to ignore the ones that would be first in line to buy tickets opening night. It wasn't as if the storytelling was so bulletproof they could do no wrong, and the box office returns for Apocalypse should have been proof for that. Apocalypse should have been the end of the Fassavoy era, at least with the movies centered around those two and Mystique. It seemed like a poignant end to have too, with the flashbacks that they had and their end conversation mirroring the one that they would eventually have in X-Men 1. A Dark Phoenix movie that centers around McAvoy, Fassbender, and Lawrence should have never existed. If one were to exist, it should have been recentered around an entirely new team save for McAvoy, but even he would be relegated to maybe a secondary character so the kids could take the spotlight. This would give creatives room to breathe new life into the story and script, as Vaughn had done with First Class. The X-Men prequels had faults throughout their movies, some even stemming from the movies that were well received by audiences. To say Apocalypse was the first sign of trouble is not really accurate when you realize how far back some of these issues reached. As much as I feel for the actors that would have had to endure hours and hours of makeup and prosthetics, it would have been on the makeup department to try to make this as easy for the actor as possible, not the script to force in explanations as to why characters shouldn't look like themselves.
You see they're like writing around my blue, like.
And if the makeup department has done all they can, to which I heard they narrowed an 8-hour process down from Rebecca Romaine down to a 4-hour process with Lawrence.
It was actually way better this year. We got down from like 8 hours to 3 hours.
It's on the actor and studio to prioritize a story and characters above all else, even if that means parting with said character. And more than that, Fox needs to trust that fresh characters are risks, but necessary ones in order to keep audiences engaged. Yes, we love seeing Magneto and Xavier, but that doesn't mean we don't have any love left for characters like Cyclops, Jean, Storm, or Nightcrawler. And if Fox wants to keep their legacy strong, they should have learned to take a leaf out of Marvel's book and know that even if you nailed the casting for the first time around, building the next generation of characters is just as important for any franchise to thrive. Even though I did have issues with some of these movies, I do appreciate all that they have done, and it's not easy to hit this out of the park, and I think Marvel is definitely the exception, not the rule, so it's good to keep that in mind, not to just shit over everything that a whole studio and team and crew has done for us all these years. So I just think that we can learn something from it, and hopefully we do. Thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate you guys staying to the end of this video. Click like and subscribe if you want to see more like this, and I'll see you next time. Fassbender is fantasy husband number 1, McAvoy is number 2. Just so I get to keep McAvoy for longer. And just admire Fassbender from the side.